speak about the biggest developments across the world in geopolitics in the last 7 days with our guest and expert, Sridhavesh Singh Mani. Thank you very much, sir, for being here as always.
Thank you. My pleasure.
At the top, sir, I want to focus on China's expansion into the Middle East. Now, Syria has also joined the Belt and Road Initiative of China. And, at a time when the US seems to signal that it's not prioritizing the Middle Eastern region in its foreign policy. So do you think China's set to wield more influence in this region? What could that entail? And how are other Middle Eastern nations going to respond to this?
Yes, so that's a very important development. And I think that's part of it's actually part of a number of other important developments which have taken place in recent days. So as we've discussed in an earlier show, that you had a visit, for instance, from the foreign ministers of GCC countries and the Secretary General also of the GCC. And that was a 5-day visit last week. That was followed by a visit of the Turkish foreign minister and then the Iranian foreign minister. And then you had this, Syria getting onto the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think there are 2 or 3 things. The first thing is that, for very long, we've been looking at the Middle East in terms of, there's a zero sum. The US and, many other countries, they look at this whole Middle East and the geopolitics of the Middle East in a sort of zero-sum perspective. So there's, the GCC on the one hand, Iran on the other, the Gulf countries on the one hand and Iran on the other. Now, one of the major changes which has taken place is the Gulf countries wanting to improve ties with Iran. So that has really changed the geopolitics of the region. And China has obviously, rather than looking at it from a zero-sum perspective, China is actually trying to be a bridge between GCC and Iran. In fact, this was one of the issues which was discussed, having some a regional sort of forum where the GCC and Iran both can be brought on board to discuss issues of regional importance. But obviously, China has sensed, and as have many other Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE, which have very strong ties with the US, that the US is beginning to, obviously it has a very important role in the Middle East, but its role in the Middle East is beginning to change, and probably like other parts of the world, the US is becoming slightly more, not isolationist, but slightly pulling out, in the sense that earlier it was very interventionist and proactive. Probably now this whole thing that, that the US needs to look inwards and sort out its own domestic issues, that is to some extent has impacted its Middle East policy. And then finally, of course, what has influenced countries like UAE and Saudi Arabia, some of the other GCC countries also, to improve their ties with China is, one, the US emphasis on reduction of dependence on these countries for their oil needs. So that has obviously meant that the GCC countries need to look towards China, right? And then even also the Biden administration's policy also has not been like what the Trump administration followed. So in such a situation, then GCC also has made those adjustments. But China also realizes that it cannot suddenly fill in the vacuum, or it's not going to suddenly become more influential than the US. This is also posturing by some of the GCC countries, which want to send out a message to the US that we are not going to choose, we won't be pushed to make choices between China and the US. As far as Syria and Iran are concerned, these are very important developments. But I think the most important thing is that now you cannot look at the Middle East from very simplistic sort of lenses, or you can't just break it down, because last year or two, a lot of other developments have taken place. And China has probably been quite deft at sort of, adapting to these developments. Its economic leverage in the region, obviously, is very important in that context.
Okay. Moving on to, keeping our focus on China and US relations now. So now China is hell-bent on a zero COVID policy before the February 4th Winter Games. And it has, incidentally, it's traced one COVID-19 case to a single piece of mail that came to the country from China via US and Hong Kong. So it's saying that this, COVID emerged from US apparently. It's also been defending the nation. China's been defending itself, saying that COVID-19 emerged elsewhere and it came through cold chain to its country, to its shores. But the previous president of US, Donald Trump, has been attacking China. He even branded the virus as the China virus. So relations have been sour anyway. However, with Biden now in the driving seat, even then the relations seem to be bitter. So what's your assessment of this? Are US and China relations going to be on the mend in the near future?
So I think you can we can comfortably say that some of this is rhetoric. Basically the China-US relationship also, there'll be areas like we've discussed earlier where they'll be compelled to cooperate. But in recent months, I think both sides have upped the ante. If you see, US has imposed sanctions on Chinese entities, on Chinese individuals and officials for the human rights violations in Xinjiang. Then with regard to Hong Kong, also they've imposed sanctions, for the suppression of democratic movements over there. And right now, China has taken retaliatory measures. So that is one part of it. But now I think some of the actions which are being taken by China are retaliatory sort of step against what basically the diplomatic boycott by the US, Canada, and Australia of the Beijing Winter Olympics. I mean, it's quite evident because, for instance, a number of flights were cancelled. Because I think there was a couple of flights in the US, and passengers on their arrival in China, they tested positive. So China said that that we have to be more cautious with the flights in the US. And then, in fact, for a period of 2 weeks, all flights in the US have been cancelled. Now, naturally, the US airlines lobby has taken note of this, and air connectivity is another major, apart from trade, technology and all, air connectivity is a very important linkage. So to try and disturb that means obviously that China is willing to up the ante further. And as far as this other, again, I think symbolically, it's basically a sort of the fact that it was spoken, Canada has also been brought in, is very clear that it's China sort of symbolism, that it hasn't forgotten the fact that these countries have boycotted the Beijing because of the diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Winter Olympics. As it is, there were tensions between the US and China. What has also happened now is, as we have said, discussing earlier, other countries too have taken strong steps against China, which was probably China did not expect. So, for instance, whether it's UK, whether it's Canada, whether it's Australia, on human rights issues, on Hong Kong, they've taken very strong steps, and the US and these other countries have found common ground. So it's not only the US-China relationship. I think the West as a whole, plus obviously Australia as well, I think it's going to have the trajectory of ties with China is going to be very different. There will be areas where we'll find common ground, but unless even there is some course correction from China also, I don't think this good, because there have been voices within China which have also been saying that China also needs to be a bit less aggressive vis-a-vis the US, that this is not very in its national interest. Probably along with some of the other domestic policies, China also needs a course correction. And the West also, the Biden administration has been speaking about diplomacy, but I think the sticky issues are still there. And in spite of that, as you said, they have been imposing sanctions. Both sides have been imposing sanctions on each other. So I think a course correction is needed from both sides. And also, it will require some sort of, from both sides, a bit of some risk-taking ability is needed to cool down the tempers as well.
Okay. Next, I have there was this happy news, which is rare in the media last week. A heartwarming reunion of two brothers who got separated in 1947, and they met after 74 years via the Kartarpur corridor, which allows visa-free travel between India and Pakistan. So, you've always in previous shows, you've spoken about the importance of trade and people-to-people ties. So do you think this illustrates that, and do you think the two nations realize the benefit of it?
So, like I said earlier also, that there are numerous layers. Now, as far as in Indo-Pak relationship is concerned, it's very complex. But this is an important layer of diplomacy. And probably at times we tend to underestimate it. Obviously, there are disputes which have been there for very long. You're not going to find a solution for them. But I think this layer of, one is this Punjabiyat, common Punjabi identity, the bonhomie which exists on both sides of the divide in terms of, at least at the level of the two Punjabs. I think this can be used, and this will benefit not just the two Punjabs, ultimately both the nations as well. Because in the past, as we have said earlier also, whenever the two Punjabs have opened up, it's paved the way for other exchanges, including in areas like trade. So one part is people-to-people contact. I think that is important, not just in the context of diplomacy, but these are layers of history which should not be overlooked. And I think what is happening is, so one of the organizations which actually facilitated this Punjabi Leher, they have been collecting stories from both sides of partition survivors. So unless, because word of mouth plays a very important role in our region. So whether India and Pakistan can resolve that is an important issue, but at least this history should not get obliterated. So one part is that, when you have such, because a number of families have actually got reunited in the last few months to the Kartarpur corridor, and as a result of this TV channel, sort of connecting families and friends. So that's a very important part. The second part is the next step, which is that, you begin with people-to-people ties, connectivity, and which has been alluded to also, that ultimately, cross-border trade, along with, say, things like religious tourism, are very important for both sides. And I think last year also there were some positive indicators that trade may open up, but at the last moment, didn't go ahead. But it's good because, the world over, ultimately, if you look at the geopolitics at this point of time, we can look at the great powers, but within South Asia itself, South Asian countries, they need to find their own solutions. Nobody else is going to really sort of help. And this will reduce your dependence. If not just India, Pakistan, but other parts of the region, if trade builds up, if there's greater connectivity, I think your dependence on the rest of the world will reduce. And as yet, of course, the starting point, because as many analysts have argued, the problem within South Asia is basically the India-Pakistan conflict. There are, of course, at a bilateral level, you can have trade. For instance, India-Bangladesh is one instance. But you do need to have the level of South Asia itself. It needn't be necessarily only SAARC, but other ways of promoting connectivity. And I think this is a very good template. And it's happened, of course, in a very organic way. And these are things which strategic analysts often would sort of overlook. But in this part of the world, it's very important, because we often look at everything from a Western narrative. Even the narrative of soft power is always looked at from a Western lens. But this is the organic sort of soft power of this region.
I'll leave it here this time. Thank you very much, sir, for that insightful conversation. And to our viewers, I request you to tune in to Global Chit Chat next week. Thank you.